what happens is that wage pressure goes to the downside. So this is where the threat of negative inflation comes from, is that we've got so many unemployed people that wages collapse. And if wages collapse, that gets passed through into the CPI. Now, this is not happening yet, but the danger is that it could happen if we allow the unemployment rate to remain too high for too long. Again, this is the classic lesson of depressions, is that you must avoid falling wages, because you develop this spiral where wages and prices fall together. And the experience of countries that suffered this is that it is the devil's own job to get out of it. So this is why the Fed is doing everything it possibly can, and why the federal government ultimately has to do more as well, because we have to prevent the labor market becoming so slack that people will work for buttons, because that is actually a disaster. It's paradoxical, because as an employer, you think, great, I'm getting my labor cheaper, but actually for the economy as a whole, that's the worst possible thing, the worst.
Right. Ian,
I just like to add one thing to that from a perspective that we see at the bank. And I do agree with Ian that it's important to maintain wages and wage growth, because it creates a vicious cycle. The one countervailing event that I do see, which could end up helping employment to some degree, at least at the margins, but raising costs, is we've noticed that a number of clients who had supply chains, particularly from China, have immediately had to regroup and create alternative supplies. In some cases, literally retrofitting or rebuilding or doing other things to manufacture component materials here. So that when you read that something's made in the USA, sometimes a lot of it is made in China or in Taiwan or in other places. One example is, for example, ibuprofen. About 80 ibuprofen, Advil, and it's marketed under a number of names. We were importing about 80% for many companies of the components that were utilized to make Advil, even though the Advil itself was being made, here or in Connecticut. And so that's something that we're not just seeing in the pharmaceutical area, we're seeing across the range. And the other issue which I think is being superimposed on this is what's going on with the current trade tensions between the United States and China, which is that particularly what's in the news is 5G, but other types of chips, chip needs, not just for 5G, are being questioned on a national security basis here. I know that's happening actually in the UK to some degree as well, with this government, which I think is a valid concern. It's sort of, again, is outside of pure economic perspective. But I think for better, for worse, I think we've already passed peak globalization, which means that as countries start producing more internally, they're going to do so less efficiently. If we had a purely efficient world trade scheme where everyone trusted each other, prices would continue to decline for raw materials and but we are going to see that, and we are going to see people brought into the manufacturing sector who actually may not want to have been in the manufacturing sector, but that's where the jobs are going to be.
We have a question on that for you later. So let me stop you there, and I'm going to head back to Ian and come back to you on that. Would that be all right with you?
That was it.
Thank you. Now, about the stimulus packages and the sustainability, I would like to ask Ian, how sustainable is it for us to keep doing this as a federal government or the Fed? And what do you think the worst case scenario or the worst case scenarios regarding these packages? Because how long, let's say if the vaccine does not come into the forum by Christmas, how long do you think a government can sustain doing this?
Well, this is a question to which there isn't a definitive answer, because in terms of the US, The US is in a unique position because the US is the provider of the dollars, which is the world's reserve currency. So
on my way කියලා.
I think I've got someone coming over on the audio there. So the US is in a different position pretty much to everybody else. The US gets to cheat, if you like, because the US creates creates dollars, which is the world's reserve currency. So does that mean that the US can just run 20% of GDP budget deficits forever? Well, no. Ultimately, it can't because of the cost of servicing it, which right now is extremely low, but it probably wouldn't be in the event that we're running 20% of GDP budget deficits indefinitely. But at a minimum, I think we can afford to do this without too much trouble for a couple of years. That would raise the public debt ratio by about 40 percentage points, which would be very roughly equivalent to the increase in the final years of the Second World War. It would leave the level of debt higher, but the financing cost is a lot lower. So remember, what is the burden of debt? The burden of debt is not the debt itself. It is the cost of funding it. Nobody stopped any economic activity because they had a debt. They stopped their economic activity or they curtailed their economic activity because they couldn't afford to service the debt, or they had to devote too much of their resources to servicing the debt so that they couldn't do anything else. Mm-hmm. The US is a million miles from this, a million miles. It's a very different story if you're sitting in an emerging market where first of all, your currency is not the dollar, where you're relying on foreigners to fund you, and where there isn't trust and there isn't credibility and there isn't history. But the thing is that everybody knows that if they buy $1 of treasury debt, whatever the interest rate is, high, low, or medium, they're going to get the interest. Now, the inflation rate will determine what that interest is worth, but they will get it. They will get it. Whereas if you're, lending dollars to Brazil or Argentina, there's actually a non-zero chance that you won't get it. And we've seen this over and over again.
Right.
So, the US, Europe, Japan, Canada, Australasia, developed economies, they do get to do things that is much more difficult for emerging markets. And so that's yet another reason why the incidence of COVID, I think, ultimately will be much worse in emerging economies than it is in the developed economies of the West. And obviously the emerging economies, have much weaker healthcare systems and all the rest of it. They tend to have younger populations, which is good, but they do tend to have less wealth